Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Brexit and Cambodia, why the UK's exit from the EU is having an impact as far away as Southeast Asia. Lebanon has a new government, but can it fix what some are calling a zombie economy? Also this week, why Samsung just launched a very pricey folding smartphone. And river wars, a sacred waterway, comes under threat in the Philippines. Cambodia has been one of the best performing economies in the world over the past 2 decades, but there are threats on the horizon, including, surprisingly, the UK's impending exit from the European Union. The German Development Institute has studied how Brexit affects least developed countries. It found Cambodians living on the brink of poverty are at risk. That's if the country's garment producers lose access to UK markets. Al Jazeera's Wayne Hay is in Phnom Penh with a look at how people relying on the textile industry for their livelihoods are vulnerable to any external shocks.
The story of Cambodia's rise is a remarkable one. From the ashes of genocide and civil war, this country has in 4 decades rebuilt and transformed. On the back of foreign investment and strong exports, this year Cambodia is forecast to have the 6th fastest growing economy in the world, a ranking it's had for 20 years. The wealthy have become very wealthy, although exactly how much money they have is in many cases impossible to know, given that Cambodia is also regarded by some as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. In the last few years, a small middle class has also begun to emerge, thanks partly to a surge of foreign investment in real estate, led by China.
There's been a lot of trickle-down, spillover effects everywhere in the country, making the real estate or the land more expensive, and some people can get money from selling a piece of land, and this capital has been moving around in the country.
Poverty rates in Cambodia have fallen in the last 15 years, with 12% of the population now classified as severely poor, a lower figure than before. But the overwhelming majority of those who have climbed off the bottom are only just above it, meaning they could easily slip down again. The United Nations estimates that more than 20% of Cambodians are vulnerable to poverty. The statistics are heading in the right direction, but there's an underlying fragility. Cambodia's economy has been largely built on agriculture and textile exports, 2 sectors it still very much relies on. The concern is there hasn't been enough emphasis on diversifying the economy, and because of that, its vulnerability could be easily exposed. There are a number of threats to Cambodia's growth, including drought that's forecast this year, a possible global economic slowdown, or tariffs being imposed on its exports by the European Union over its human rights record. But for many people, there are more immediate concerns, made worse by the real estate boom. Urban poor live with the constant fear of being forced out when a property developer comes knocking.
Living
in this community, I'm very concerned every day. I don't have a land title because the authorities haven't registered it to the people, so we're always worried about being evicted.
Cambodia is developing fast, but there are many threats emerging that could make for an uncertain economic future and a longer wait for some to climb out of poverty.
Joining us now from Hong Kong is Ruben Mondejar. Ruben is a professor for Asian initiatives at the Business School, University of Navarra. Good to have you with us again, Ruben. So Cambodia's economy is on the verge of an economic crisis. Why?
Well, for several reasons. They have never been really that healthy. But all of these issues they have recently, actually beginning also from the political infrastructure that they have, which does not really give market liberalization. And so they have few advantages. They were quite happy with their textiles, which many people would notice that their shirts are made in Cambodia. And then one of those benefits they had was their entry to the European Union, actually through UK, which is not just Cambodia. You have the same instance for Myanmar, for Vietnam. But anyway, Cambodia is more particular because they will be hit hardly when Brexit takes into effect. So in other words, all their financial facilitation through UK would stop. They will have to find a new way. Now, the economic situation in Cambodia is not just that. They also have been so dependent on China that now that China is having a trade war with the U.S., again, anything that happens to China will really affect them very hard. So that's going to be the story for Cambodia until they reform.
Ruben, if thousands of people in the textile industry in Cambodia end up losing their jobs because of the state of the economy, because of Brexit,
Yes.
because of what's going on with China at the moment, how would that impact upon the government of Prime Minister Hun Sen? I mean, Cambodia is effectively a one-party state, isn't it?
Yes, but at the same time, a decline in the economy at this point in time in their history is not that different from what has been happening in the past. I don't believe that a decline now, in, let's say, in the GDP growth will mean that Hun Sen will be removed. He will be there more entrenched than ever before until he decides that it's time already for him to leave. So, well, they will have to find other sources of growth. They'll have to find some ways to employ their people. Agriculture is still strong for them, has always been one of their mainstays. They will have to ask for infrastructure help from China. Building of roads and that will give employment to China. And China is actually quite generous with Cambodia. I don't think it's in the interest of China for Cambodia to slide down economically, because it's one of the loyal kind of states to China, so in Southeast Asia. And so China has actually used Cambodia a lot for its geopolitical work in Southeast Asia. So I'm not so worried about a decline in economics will mean a decline in the political strength of the current administration.
You mentioned countries like Vietnam and Myanmar that could also be potentially exposed to Brexit turbulence. However, Britain ends up leaving the EU. I mean, how will their economies fare compared to Cambodia?
Well, Vietnam has more strength economically than Cambodia. They are first of all, it's a bigger economy, so there is more resilience in their situation. They have also benefited actually from the trade war. You know, companies have begun to move their manufacturing to Vietnam, and this has already been being felt. So Vietnam is actually a good kind of absorber of the negative effects of the China trade war. So also, I believe that the economic management in Vietnam is much better than Cambodia, even much better than Myanmar. So actually, Vietnam is one of the star economies in that area of Southeast Asia. Well, you consider the three countries of Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam is a star performer.
Ruben, always good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
My pleasure.
There's now a smartphone that you can fold in half. South Korean giant Samsung unveiled the new device as part of its new generation of Galaxy phones. But will it be enough for the industry leader to overcome a shrinking market? Kristen Salumi reports from New York.
The next generation Samsung smartphone will also serve as a tablet.
When it's folded, it has a 4.6-inch display. It's compact and perfectly portable. But when the device opens up, your world does too.
Not surprisingly, Samsung's newest device is called the Fold, and it was unveiled with all of the fanfare you've come to expect from the world's leading smartphone maker.
But here's where things get really cool.
It goes on sale in April, but it and Samsung's new S10 and S10 Plus are being released amid faltering worldwide sales.
People have a little bit of phone fatigue. All the phones look the same, they feel the same. This new Galaxy S10 is not really going to break the mold, but we've seen some hints of things that are coming in the future that might get people really excited.
The issue, whether buying Samsung or an Apple device, is increasingly price. With the Fold costing about $2,000, Samsung will have to convince consumers that they just have to have it.
Pretty much I look for price to performance, so if the performance is there that I'm looking for, most likely I'll go for it. I replace my phone every 3 or 4 years. I'm not within the 18 to 24 month update cycle. I'm not rich enough for that.
The global smartphone market is shrinking after years of rapid growth, with consumers waiting for the next game-changing feature and major markets like here in the United States at saturation. Still, smartphone sales are a vital part of the global economy. In 2017, smartphone sales reached nearly $460 billion. But the rising price tag for the better-known smartphones is not just an issue in the developed world.
And there is heavy headwind against the high-end smartphones. We saw that with iPhone 10. The sales were not that great. There's some macro issues as well. China is slowing down. India is okay, but Europe is slowing down.
With the release of the Fold, industry leaders seem convinced that continuing innovation and the ability to access 5G data networks in the near future will be enough to keep smartphone consumers coming back for more.
Still to come on Counting the Cost. Back in fashion, the beauty salons forced out of business under ISIL get a makeover in Mosul. But first, 9 months later, Lebanon has a government, but its economy is screaming for attention, and it could be at risk of collapse if some key areas aren't made into a priority. Our economics editor, Abid Ali, has the breakdown for us.
Thank you, Adrian. We're talking about a zombie economy here, a huge, unsustainable public debt that is literally sucking the life out of Lebanon's finances. Lebanon is the third most indebted nation in the world, and most of it is owned by local banks. Half of the government's money goes towards servicing its debt. Meanwhile, youth unemployment is at double digits. As a result, there are up to 14 million Lebanese living abroad. The money they send home makes up a fifth of the overall economy. Then there's a war on its borders with Syria, but Lebanon's economic problems existed before the war. 1/3 of the country is living below the poverty line, while the country's debts continue to be paid. Back to you, Adrian.
Abid, well, joining us now from Beirut is Nassib Gabriel. Nassib is Chief Economist and Head of the Economic Research and Analysis Department at Biblos Bank Group. Good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. $11 billion pledged by international donors last year to help Lebanon's economy. But to access those funds, this new government has to implement pretty tough economic and financial reforms like narrowing the budget deficit, fiscal reforms, fighting corruption. Can it do it?
That's a very good point. The government of Lebanon, irrespective of the $11 billion in pledges by the international community to help upgrade the infrastructure in the country, had to address these reforms because of the competitiveness of the Lebanese economy has declined over the recent few years. The investment climate, the business environment have deteriorated, and that's very obvious from the global indices like the Global Competitiveness Index by the World Economic Forum and the Ease of Doing Business survey by the World Bank. So these reforms were overdue anyway. There is an added incentive to start implementing these reforms to reduce the fiscal deficit, to improve the business environment, to upgrade existing laws, to reduce the operating costs on the private sector with the pledges of $11 billion because they are conditional on those reforms. And there are specific sectoral reforms where the funds will go and finance infrastructure projects that need to be implemented as well. So these reforms have been overdue, and the priority of this government has to be reducing the borrowing needs of the Lebanese state by shrinking the budget deficit, and second, stimulating growth to increase economic activity since economic growth has averaged 1.5% since 2011.
How does it do all of that, though, when corruption is such a big problem there in Lebanon, too? I mean, can the government really get a grip on corruption?
Well, the government has to try. The government has to try. One of the positive things about the new government is that its ministerial statement, its action plan, include very specific points about reforms, which is the first for Lebanese governments. One of the points included is to reduce the size and restructure the public sector, to stop recruiting in the public sector, And that's one way of addressing political nepotism. Corruption has to be addressed gradually. There are draft laws waiting to be passed in Parliament that will help develop a national strategy to fight corruption. But definitely this is one of the major challenges facing the current government.
Okay, let's talk about, you mentioned it earlier, the amount of debt that Lebanon is servicing at the moment. Who actually owns that debt? And what are its implications for the future?
Yes, the Lebanese debt, the Lebanese public debt reached $85 billion at the end of 2018. 60% of this public debt is in Lebanese pounds and 40% is in foreign currencies, mainly in US dollars. The 60% of the debt in Lebanese pound is held by Lebanese commercial banks, by the Central Bank of Lebanon, by the National Social Security Fund, and by local insurance companies. So 100% of the Lebanese pound-denominated debt is held by local Lebanese institutions. The 40% in foreign currencies, 94% of it is Eurobonds, market Eurobonds, and the rest is bilateral and multilateral loans. The Eurobond components are held by commercial banks and the central bank, and the rest is held by foreign asset managers. So foreign asset managers hold $9 billion of the Lebanese public debt, which means that 89% of the Lebanese public debt is held by Lebanese institutions, whether private or public. And therefore, that provides stability to the public debt despite being equivalent to 150% of GDP, the third highest level in the world.
You say stability, and however, when there are so many vested interests there that you're talking about, I mean, and that's one of the reasons perhaps why Lebanon's banking sector has been so resilient.
Yes, but what I mean by public finance stability, and specifically regarding the public debt, is with this high level of public debt, $85 billion, equivalent to 150% of GDP, it's still stable. You don't see heavy fluctuation overall in the public debt, in the prices of Lebanese pound-denominated treasury bills or treasury bonds. We've seen some fluctuations in the prices of Eurobonds in 2018, but overall, given the high level of the public debt, it is still stable because exactly 89% of it is being financed by local institutions who do not panic at the slightest political deadlock or security shock or regional instability. That does not mean that there is no urgency to reduce the size of the public debt through reducing the fiscal deficit. Definitely, this is a top priority of the current government.
Nasib, really great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, there are some signs of progress on the streets of Mosul, a city that used to be ISIL's self-declared capital in Iraq. The armed group was defeated there more than 18 months ago, and people are now beginning to return to what's left of the city. Charles Stratford reports from Mosul.
A beauty salon in eastern Mosul. Business as usual, in one of several to open in the city since ISIL was forced out almost 2 years ago. Before that, women here caught wearing makeup or not covering their faces would be whipped 70 times.
We didn't have beauty salons when ISIL ruled in Mosul, but after they were defeated, the beauty business has become popular again. It's a sign of overcoming ISIL's indoctrination.
Life on the surface, at least, may be returning to normal in the east of the city, but just 2 kilometers away, it's a very different world. This is western Mosul, what used to be the old city where ISIL fighters put up their last stand. Last year, international donors pledged around $30 billion in loans and investment to help rebuild devastated parts of Iraq, including Mosul, but the results are slow in coming.
It's been more than a year and a half since victory over ISIL was declared here, and there's very little sign of reconstruction having started yet. There are daily reports of ISIL supporters and fighters trying to recruit in areas they once controlled. The territorial battle against ISIL may be over, but the ideological battle goes on.
One of the reasons ISIL was able to take root in Mosul and vast swathes of Iraq's Sunni heartland in the west and north of the country was because of what the Sunni communities said was neglect, discrimination and often violence by repeated Shia-led governments. But all suffered terrible atrocities under ISIL's rule, Shia, Christian, Yazidi and Sunni alike. According to Iraq's national security advisor, ISIL is already trying to reorganize and has increased its activities in parts of north and western Iraq. Iraqi security forces continue to arrest members of what they describe as ISIL sleeper cells. In recent months, ISIL is reported to have kidnapped and murdered dozens of people it accused of cooperating with Iraqi security forces. And there have been countless attacks by ISIL on Iraqi soldiers and members of the various pro-Iran armed groups that were at the forefront of the fight against ISIL. The local government in Mosul says they are taking measures against any attempt to spread ISIL's message.
I have ordered for unified Friday sermons in all mosques in Nineveh province, focused on counteracting ISIL's ideology and highlighting the atrocities committed by them and how people should work together to overcome the remnants of ISIL's culture.
At the place where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself caliph of ISIL's so-called caliphate in 2014, officials lay a plaque marking the start of a 5-year project to rebuild the An-Nuri mosque. But Iraqis, their leaders and governments around the world know it will take more than just reconstruction to defeat ISIL's ideas.
And finally this week, in the northern Philippines, a plan to build a dam on a river that's held sacred by a tribe has been met by fierce opposition. The reservoir is supposed to secure water supply for the capital, Manila. But as Jamala Alindogan reports from the Sierra Madre Mountains in Tanay, tribal leaders say it will destroy their way of life.
The whole forest is steeped in legend. And with the arrival of tourists and modern living, the Dumagat people struggle to be heard. Which is why they insist on practicing their age-old customs, no matter how out of place they may seem. The Kaliwa River is sacred for the Dumagat. They have been praying here for centuries. A new government project is threatening to take it away.
This ecosystem is our life, our livelihood. This is our home, and we would like to fight for it. The Dumagat people are coming together to speak up so that everyone will know that this land belongs to us. We inherited this from our ancestors.
The Philippine government wants to build a 70-meter-high water reservoir here, displacing not only the Dumagat people, but also endangered species in the forest. That plan threatens to obliterate a way of life here that is centuries old. The multi-million-dollar project, partially funded by the Chinese government, is expected to ensure water security for the capital, Manila, by damming the Kaliwa River. Experts say new water sources are needed. Millions of Filipinos don't have access to clean, safe, and reliable water supplies. The Asian Development Bank, among others, is warning the Philippines it is likely to face a water crisis within the next few years, threatening not only drinking water shortages in towns and cities, but in heavily dependent agricultural communities too.
This is a program that has been in the work for more than almost 40 years. We have been in constant dialogue with the indigenous people. In fact, even in the relocation side, we consider the culture of the people. Except that there are certain things that we have to sacrifice a little bit.
Despite the assurances, opposition remains because of the destruction of the fragile ecosystem.
I think it's not worth it because we have other means to supply water to Metro Manila. There are several endemic species in the Sierra Madre mountain range that can only be seen in the Philippines. So the first effect of the Kaliwa watershed is the death of those species.
It is a tough balance, and as government looks for solutions, there may be lessons that can be learned from indigenous tribes. For centuries, they were able to survive and live in harmony with nature without destroying it.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you could drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it from this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.